Everyone still awake after lunch?
No, they're all asleep. I can tell they're all asleep.
Well, my name is Angeline Tan, and I am the moderator for this panel about Agile and code maintainability. And a little one-sentence thing, I am an Agile coach by profession, and I work at GE, which is a ginormous corporate company. So I am here to moderate the panel, and I'll turn it to Carl.
Hi, I'm Kyle Simpson. Most people online know me as Getify. I dabble a bit with JavaScript, and I like to teach JavaScript. Actually, it definitely feels a little bit strange for me to be on this panel because I don't talk about or teach anything in the Agile realm, but I will say this, I am officially endorsed on LinkedIn for Agile, 2 different previous jobs of mine, and not just like the skill Agile, but people wrote out that I helped bring Agile to a team. So that's my qualification to be on this panel, is that I'm quite the outsider, and I just made stuff up, and we called it Agile. So I bring the outsider perspective for sure.
I don't know, that sounds scary.
Hello, I am Jina Ann, and I actually thought I was the outsider because I'm the token designer on the panel. And I've been working at Salesforce for 5 years on the Lightning design system, and it's all about bringing consistency to our UI. And so been working on that for a while in the design system space, love SaaS refactoring and all that stuff. I am going into consulting after this, so it'll be interesting to see where I play into other people's workflows.
Hi, I'm Sarah. My qualification to be up here, I think, is that I worked at Pivotal Labs for about 4 years, doing their version of Agile. And I've also done a lot of other different versions of it, some of which don't really add up together. I do a brand of consulting that is mostly about code, but of course you can't really separate the code from the process, right? So there's some coding parts of it, there's some process parts of it. But I like to come at it more from the code perspective.
Thank you, all of you. We have a very esteemed panel, and I'm a little intimidated because I do code a little in JavaScript, but it's kind of scary to be here. In Agile, it has become the de facto method that life cycle that we use to develop software. And the way that Agile is perceived, especially in the corporate world, or being sold to the corporate world, is hypervelocity. So I would like to know what you think of the hypervelocity in the expense of code quality.
Yeah, so I have a lot of opinions on that as a design systems person. It's something I definitely have struggled with as a designer. I want everything to be perfect. I want to spend a lot of time on craft and make things as perfect as possible. But not everything can be perfect, especially if you just have to ship things, especially if you're shipping things on a weekly basis or bi-weekly basis. I've had to learn to sacrifice a lot of the last 20% and then like try to come back to that at another time. But as long as we get to that 80%, then we're usually, we're good. But I would say like the process that I see that we've been kind of doing it lately has been feeling kind of agile fall-ish. Like a little, because like...
It's like the 2-week waterfall cycle.
Yeah, exactly.
Like what we call fragile.
Yes.
Waterfall and agile.
So actually, I wanted to gauge the audience here. How many of you would say that you either currently or recently worked in a job that was an agile team? Okay, so most of the room. Now, I would also hazard a guess. I don't know, and we don't have time to ask everybody, but I bet I just saw about 100 hands, and I bet if we interviewed each one of you, we'd get 100 different answers as to what that meant. that you had Agile. So let me also see a show of hands for how many people did Agile one job and switched to another Agile team and it was totally different. So that's actually, I think, kind of the problem, is that there's a lot of co-opting. Sarah said that earlier, a lot of co-opting of ideas around Agile.
And it's also common in Agile that people pick and choose. So what would you pick as the bad practices of Agile? Like sacrificing quality for speed and features for...
So because I brought Agile to two different companies, basically what that meant was we had broken process, we couldn't ship code fast enough, and whoever the decision makers were at the company said, we have to fix something, and they Googled it, and Agile popped up as, okay, so go make us an Agile. They didn't know what that meant, and it fell to us as a team to figure that out. And so I Googled it and looked at a Wikipedia page, and there were just 12 arbitrary items on this Wikipedia page about what Agile meant. And we read through them as a team, and we're like, I don't like that one, yeah, okay, that one. So we picked and choose like a buffet. Again, not being an outsider, I don't know, but I suspect picking and choosing items from Agile is kind of the problem, because I suspect that if you don't apply all of the principles holistically, you miss out, there's a lot of missing benefit. So my experience was that we picked and choose. We're like, at one company, we're like, yeah, we're going to hold up the cards and do card-based estimation. And in another one, it was like, oh, well, that we're going to do pair programming. And in other companies, it's just different mixtures thereof. So I don't even think that we necessarily have a shared lexicon, a shared set of beliefs on what the ideas actually are to be Agile. So I don't want to just bash Agile and say it doesn't work for code maintainability. But in my experience, the code often is, we use Agile as an excuse for why we don't have time to make better code.
Sarah, what do you think?
I think that Agile really only has one idea in it, and that is like short feedback loops. Every single Agile process is designed to like shorten the feedback loop between when you do something and when you know if it was the right thing to do, right? So you've got test-driven development, which is like, the idea is that you get immediate feedback as to whether or not your code is doing what you think it's doing. And then you've got the idea of like daily stand-ups, where you've got each day you have like a few minutes at the beginning of the day to reflect on what you did the previous day and to be able to summarize it and tell it to other people and surface problems that you've got. And so all of these feedback loops are designed to be shorter than they are in a waterfall process, where you've got like, design, and then you've got, like visual design is a thing, and then you have like requirements gathering, and then you have like software design, and then you have development, and then you have maintenance, and then you have QA. And all of these things just happen as like a stepwise thing, which of course never actually worked that way. Even when people were doing it, it was more like, well, we do our requirements gathering, and then we do some development, and then we realize that we were wrong about something, so we back up, and we do some more requirements design, then we go back into development, right? So it was never quite as waterfall-y as people thought it should be. And then they were like, how about we just decide that we don't know what we need to do, and we'll just make these feedback loops shorter so that we can do less wrong stuff. But then somehow it got, what started as a way to get better feedback turned into this, here's a checklist of stuff to do, right? And what happens is that we look at these lists of things to do, and we're like, okay, I don't think this one's going to work for our team. But because there's nothing on that Wikipedia page about why you do it, right? There's no way for us to figure out like what else could we do? What else could we do in order to get the benefits of pair programming if pair programming doesn't work for us? And so I feel like that's what we're missing, right? Like there's very little education out there about like why you do these things and how else you might get those benefits. So anyway, that's what I think.
I agree with that, because in Agile is only 12 years or 13 years old. And when it got first started, it was hailed as like, oh, it's a eureka moment. But Agile has been around for a while, and there has been some criticism of Agile that we put a premium on speed, shipping out features. And the thing is that what I got from my engineers, the main pain that they're feeling is that they didn't have time to think about the design, to think about how to do things. It's just go, go, go. So,
Like they're not getting all the feedback loops, right? Like they've got the feedback loop in place where they're like, okay, every 2 weeks we send something to the customer. So that's great. That's a good one to have, right? But then there's a whole bunch of other ones you need too, right? Like you need the test-driven development, which tells you that like you're doing the right thing with your code. And you need the, like if you're missing those inner loops, if all you have is that outer loop, then that's the one you focus on, right? And then everything like orients in that direction.
There's another feedback loop that I think doesn't get talked about or thought about, and I think it's the one of the missing gaps here. And it's the feedback loop between when you read a piece of code now versus when you read it 4 weeks later. It's been said that code that you wrote more than 3 weeks ago might as well have been written by somebody else. Some of us, that window is a lot shorter, like yesterday. I don't remember or understand code I wrote yesterday. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of the decision making that happens by stakeholders about we got to go, we got to ship code faster, is based upon this idea that whatever code we write now, we can come back to and revisit next iteration and come back to and revisit next iteration. And while it's true that you never seal the code and you can't ever revisit it, what is missing in the feedback loop that's missing, is that when you go back to read that piece of code later, if nobody took the time to pay attention to the readability and understandability the first time it was written, you cannot just pick up that piece of code and immediately be productively refactoring it. There's a switching cost. And the more times a piece of code gets changed, we got to go, and we got to add a feature and fix a bug. The more times it gets touched in that mindset, the bigger that switching cost becomes every time. And so the feedback loop that's missing is really the person who reads it 6 weeks from now can't go back and tell the person 6 weeks earlier, that sucked. That was terribly written, and it took me a really long time to figure that out. We're not taking that into account as we make these decisions.
Has anyone ever had an if statement that just kept accumulating else clauses? Right? Like you're like, okay, it's only 2, we'll just do an if else. No problem, right? And then like the next time you come back, there's like 5. And you're like, wait, how did this get like this, right? Yeah.
and following up on the topic of cost, most of the product management, they don't think about the cost of reworking because they think that engineers are superstars, which they are most of the time. And the thing is that when you have to do refactoring and time is involved, and it also added to the complexity if the code is not as elegant or parsimonious as it should be. So there is a question about, well, Agile is about speed. We ship the features, but then what about quality? Because if there's no quality, then you have to come back and rework again, and rework cost. So what do you think, Sarah?
Well, there's this idea of short-term velocity and long-term velocity, right? And so you're making this trade-off between like we could get this done faster now, or we could optimize more for the longer term. And it's always a bet, right? Like you're making a bet about whether or not you're going to need to do it later. And sometimes like that bet pays off and you don't need to do it later. And if you had done it right then, like you actually are saving time by not doing it because you end up not needing it later and you never look at it again. And so I think that there's that part of that cost too, right? Where you're like, well, if I'm going to do a bunch of stuff now to make this better, how do I know if I'm going to need it, right? How do I know if I'm going to come back to it 6 weeks from now?
Gina, have you ever had to go back to a piece of code you wrote before?
Absolutely. Yeah. We have a CSS framework that we work on for the Lightning design system, and we took the approach that we only build things when we need them. So if we don't need a carousel, we're not building a carousel, and hopefully we never will need a carousel. But our designs get iterated upon, and sometimes certain designs have to be deprecated because they don't perform well. So we have to go back and revisit the design as well as the CSS for that design. And it's interesting because we have a lot of rules in place around not breaking anything for people that are using the old stuff, but still having a strategy around deprecating those things so that we can move on with the new stuff. And there's a lot of headbutting going on with those conversations.
I would echo that. In my experience, before becoming a teacher, I was a developer for a really long time, and there was a lot of like coming back to stuff iteratively over and over and over again, and seeing the same feature crop up and need to be changed over time. So I totally agree that we can't know right now exactly the perfect thing that's going to be 6 months or 12 months or 24 months from now. But Sarah, you brought up an interesting point about the risk of making a bet that something is going to need to be touched later. And I would hazard the guess that that bet is a really sure bet, that there's a virtual certainty that every line of code that you write today will have to be read or maintained in some way, shape, or form, and not just simply blindly deleted. I don't know how many people, maybe your experience has been different, but I don't think if I were to poll each one of you that you would say vast swaths of my code, I write once, nobody ever reads it, and they just get deleted later. I think most of the time, we write code, and then we and other people have to read it a lot. As a matter of fact, research has been done on what we spend our time on as developers, and we spend more than 70% of our time reading code. We don't spend 70% of our time writing it. We spend 70% of our time reading it. So I think it's a virtual certainty that somebody will have to read it. I think it's a good bet that you should spend some more time making it readable because somebody's going to have to maintain it later.
I used to remember that I'm showing my age, that engineers' productivity is measured by lines of code. How many lines can you write?
What metrics for programmer productivity are a whole different rant we could go on, I think.
Yes, and the thing is that the more lines you make, the more mistakes there will be. And I had a brief conversation with Carl before the panel, is that code quality comes with the first line you write. And in Agile, because we're moving so fast, and there's different priorities, like we want you to ship this feature. And then product management, sometimes they are in a cognitive dissonance with the engineering team, because the salespeople will go out and sell and promise certain features and then come back to engineering team and say, do it. When you have such a situation, every sprint is like a little death march. You have to finish this.
Yeah, I hate the processes where it's like I commit to doing blah, blah, blah by the end of the sprint. Like, to me, that just completely anti everything that I think is Agile. This is one of these problems. You mentioned the fact that, like, basically Agile started as a way to empower developers to make the changes that they wanted to make and to be hooked into the business as they did so. And what happened instead is that it was co-opted as a tool of corporate control, and they, like so many counterculture things, right, they use the same words to mean basically the opposite of what they're supposed to mean. And so what happens is we've got all these folks that have come in more recently into the industry, and their only experience of Agile is this co-opted corporate version, right? And I find that, I feel like there's a lesson in there somehow, but I don't know what it is.
And I want to see a show of hands. How often do you feel that you're being empowered?
How many people have felt empowered today by their process?
Empowered to make decisions along with the stakeholder. And let's be honest, we love our stakeholders, they write the checks. But sometimes they do not know what they want. And then they have all these requirements and they come down to us, engineering teams, and they say that that's stupid.
So speaking of the stakeholders, because they're a really important part of this equation, they're oftentimes making those top-down decisions like, these are the features that have to be in this particular sprint or in this particular release. You engineering team, go figure out how to make that happen. We've already decided this is the stuff that is important, our customers want it, our salespeople are selling it, so go make it happen. And the tension that exists is when an engineer pushes back and says, I can't get all of those features done. There's going to be some trade-offs. And they say, well, that's fine. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just ship something. So what doesn't happen in those conversations is that an engineer doesn't often properly articulate that if I cut a corner on this line of code and get it shipped in this particular time frame, I shaved off maybe 10% of the time that I should have spent. But what will happen is that 10% saved here actually costs way more than 10% when you add up the next sprint and the next sprint and the next sprint, where I had to keep going back and fixing it and tweaking it and hacking at it because I don't even remember exactly why I did it a certain way. So I have to hack at it until it works. So when I hear people say, my boss won't give me the time to write maintainable code, it's the same argument that gets made for my boss won't let me have time to write tests, and the same argument my boss won't let me have time to write documentation. It's all three are the same symptom. And when I hear that, what I want to push back on is, if you're having the proper conversation with those stakeholders to explain to them that there is a non-zero switching cost. If I have to come back to this crappy code later, it will take more time just to get back to where I'm at now. If you had that conversation and you said the total cost of ownership of poorly written code will be much bigger, then what you really could push back on is, I don't have time not to make it maintainable. Because, to your point, I'm going to co-opt Agile for just a moment. I think we all want to ship more code faster. But truly agile code bases and truly agile processes are ones where we don't waste so much damn time trying to figure out what we did last sprint. We could be a lot faster if we took the time then to set ourselves up for next sprint. When I come back to that code, I know what it does. And I can write the feature now instead of figuring that out.
I think the writer of the Agile Manifesto, when they say that the purpose of the sprint is to have shippable code. But the problem is that everyone understood it to be, we just have to ship code. But whether the code is maintainable or has any quality, it doesn't matter. You just have to ship it. So Sarah, what do you think of that?
Well, I think, so it's true that, so you need to know what type of project you're working on, right? If you think of a sort of standard hockey stick venture capital graph, right, where you've got sort of flat at the bottom, then it goes up, and then you've got flat at the top, right? Kent Beck calls this the 3X model. So at the bottom, where you're still figuring out what you're doing, that's the explore, that's the first X, although it's an E, I don't know what, anyway, whatever. And then there's the going up part, and that's expand, and then there's a top part, which is extract. And you need different process depending on where in that curve your project is and where on that curve your company is. So your company may be up here in extract if you work somewhere big, but you could be on a project that's in explore, right? So you need to know sort of where you are on that curve and where your company is. And then I think that there are situations in which you don't need to make the code maintainable because the code has a half-life of like a week, right? If you're in this explore phase and you're still figuring out what it is and you're still like even, putting stuff out there and then, ripping it out and then doing something else, like I feel like it's a waste of time at that point to spend time on maintainability.
See, I got to disagree with that, and the reason is because when you're in that rapid exploration phase, the key is rapid. And I don't know about you, but when I'm hacking on code and I'm struggling to understand what I'm doing and I'm just throwing code in and then it like all of a sudden works and I put a comment there that says don't touch this, that is the least efficient, least rapid way to do development.
Well, like you said though, right? It's not, this is the situation in which you can rip stuff out and write it again. You know what I mean? Like you can throw it away. It's meant to, and that's always easier, right? It's always easier to throw something away than to change something that exists.
But it's terrifying to rip out a piece of code that you don't understand. It is terrifying.
But if that's what MVP is for, right? Proof of concept.
I also think, though, that there's a lot of companies that think they're in that phase that aren't, right? There's a lot of companies that are like, oh yeah, we're totally like MVP, we can do whatever we want, but they're actually in that growth phase. Right, they're trying to grow, and at that phase, I think you do need to start thinking about code quality. And at that, but I still take the view that when you're in that growth phase, the only thing that you should worry about is anything that keeps you from growing, right? So if there's a piece of code that it is a problem, it's causing you constant problems, you keep having to come back to it, and it's terrible. It's worth it to fix it if you're in this part of the curve, but it's not worth it to fix it if you never have to look at it.
Gina?
Oh, I'm not. I feel like you guys pretty much said what I agree with. But one thing, though, that's a little different with my particular role in my team is like our CSS framework, which is our code, is our product. And so code quality does matter. And that's why we have a lot of tooling that we have to work on. Like we actually have a Chrome inspector for our developers so that they can see if they're overriding our CSS. They get like a little F and they have to like fix it. And lots of linting and tooling in place that we do because it does matter to us. But it's like our job to basically help empower them to write better code. So it's a little different.
Wow, that is super interesting. I hadn't thought about that, right? So anytime you've got like an API or a library or something you're building like that, at that point, yeah, the code quality is part of the product, right?
Yeah, because any mistake that you make or any corner that you cut here will cascade to the millions of other potential users of that.
And it's happened. Like we were using, if anyone's familiar with the BEM CSS syntax, we were using that, and we didn't know all the goals for the project, where all it would be used. And it turns out the biggest user of our CSS framework is XML based, which if you're commenting out code that has double dashes, you're going to get a lot of bugs. And so we had to actually go back and deprecate every single class and add the new ones in, which was not fun, and but it is what it is. If we had known that ahead of time, we would have solved for that.
So if you can agree, and I think I do, if you can agree that there are different factors that go into deciding the relative importance of refactorability, and maybe your project stage, it's a little less important, maybe it's a little more important because it's going to be visible to millions of developers. But I think we can explore what part of the life cycle of a line of code is it easier to refactor? Is it easier to refactor a line of code that was written 10 years ago and it just kept getting hacked over the years, and we've long since forgotten all of the institutional history about where that line of code came from. The person that wrote it isn't here. There's no documentation. Nobody even really knows exactly what it does, but it sure does its job well. Is it easier to refactor that line of code or the line of code that you just wrote?
But nobody writes code in isolation, right? Like very few people actually do a greenfield project. Most of us work on projects, we walk onto projects that other people have been working on, and we're adding and changing things in other people's code, like in the context of a huge piece of code that we didn't write, or maybe we've worked on other little pieces of it before, but we're changing like one little thing here, right? And so a lot of times it feels like the safer thing to do, especially if you're in a big piece of code that you don't know, is to just make the little change that you're pretty sure is gonna work, right? And then, next time you come back to it, maybe you'll be able to gain another piece of information, right, and understand it a little bit better. And then you can, make a more systemic change if it makes sense at that point. But there's often a lot of context that we need in order to be able to refactor any single line of code, right?
And following up on that, I'm sure everyone in the audience loves writing code. That's why you're here. That's why you program for a living. But I find that some engineers really hate to work on legacy code. So I'm curious, just a show of hands, who enjoys working on legacy code and try to refactor it? Whoa! You are hired. So when code is not with quality, is not readable, therefore not maintainable, working on legacy code is very, very painful.
Which is why it is so common to get to the point, and I bet every one of you has either had this conversation or heard this conversation. You're struggling with a piece of code. You thought it would take 4 hours. You estimated 4 hours, and you're at 8 hours in, still trying to get the thing to work, and now the pressure's mounting because the sprint's coming, and at some point the conversation invariably turns to, it'd be faster if I just rewrote it. Anybody ever heard that before? It's faster if I just rewrote it. And then we substitute with, it'd be faster if I just swapped in a different JavaScript framework. Because surely the problem is that this JavaScript framework that we picked is holding us back. But there's this new one that just came out, and it promises to answer all of our problems.
Well, sometimes
like I
I'm,
just did a
I'm
talk
guilty
about
of
that.
that too, because it's like instead of me trying to figure this out, I just do it my way. Just, start over. Who has done that before? Yeah, it's okay, I won't judge you.
Oh, come on. More of you have thrown away code and rewritten it. Come on, you got to admit that. It's fun, isn't it?
Well,
yeah, and then 18 hours later, you're like, oh, that's why it was like that.
You come right back to the same problem again.
Well, about estimation, Agile is all about, how much work can you do, estimate, commit. And estimation has been in discussion the few recent years, right? Because a lot of people say that what does it mean to estimate is nothing but a big freaking lie. I don't know. This feature is new. How would I know how many points to give it to? So I'm curious that what you guys think about
I hate story pointing and estimation. I hate it so much because I'm always wrong every single time. I always think, oh, that's really easy, and then it turns out it's not. Or I think it's easy. I give it a low score. Everyone's like, "Are you sure?" And then I overestimate. It's painful. I hate it.
I think it is fun to play with the playing cards. That part
Yeah.
I find fun.
I've never done the playing
But
card version.
the
How does that even work?
consequences are bad.
You hold the
Like
little
you
cards
just-
up
you-
with your points and see what.
You
at the
literally
same
like
time.
hold it up. Yeah, everybody
do that?
picks up a
Yeah.
card, and then if half the room picked up 5s and the other half picked up 8s, then you average the two, and that's the.
And we have some
story.
remote people, so sometimes we'll
Huh.
just do like fingers, like 1 or 2 or whatever.
That's normally what I do. We do like, if we're all in the same room, you go 1, 2, 3.
There you go. That's the same thing as the cards. Speaking of this estimation problem, though, because I think all developers can deal with that, one of the things that's very important in the kind of agile way of thinking is pair programming. And I've actually found that pair programming in the small, not necessarily like 100% all day, every day pair programming, but pair programming when you're struggling with something or when you're just starting to sketch out a feature, I think that pair programming actually develops our skill of estimation because you have another person you're rubber ducking with. And you're like, I think we should do it this way. And they will think of something that you didn't think of. They're like, yeah, but that won't work because of this other part of the system. So you start to develop an instinct when you're working with another person that now I know when I start to talk about a feature, I probably better give that an 8 instead of a 5 because last time I didn't think about that complexity.
That's really interesting because I always do story pointing in the group. So I never point stuff on my own. And it's the same, and that's for the same reason, right? Because someone's like, a lot of times it'll be like, everyone else is a 1, and I'm like, and everyone's like, what do you know that we don't know? And then and I'll explain it. And sometimes I'm right, but sometimes I'm wrong, right? Sometimes I'm like, oh no, that is not a thing. This is not connected to that. And you're like, okay, well, and so I'm perfectly happy to go back, down to the 1 or whatever. But I feel like that also gives all of us as a group a better understanding of what is happening, like what everyone is working on.
Speaking of things I hate, I absolutely hate those meetings because when I did work on those teams, we had, like, of my 40 hours in the sprint planning week, we would spend 15 hours in meetings before we even got to doing any writing of code. So we always wanted to keep those meetings as short as possible, which is why we would have the engineers discuss the complexity of something long before that meeting. Because when we got into the meeting and everybody holds up their different numbers, if you have to then go and argue about it and talk about all the technical stuff, half the room doesn't know, because half the room there is stakeholders of like product owner people, they don't know.
Well, that's what backlog grooming meeting is for. You trash it all out.
I mean, the way that I deal with that is that, like, if it feels like we're having an argument or a discussion about something, we just give it a higher number for uncertainty, right? So basically, like, if there's disagreement, we just cut it off and we're like, okay, we're going to give this a higher number because we're not certain. And that seems to work pretty well.
The problem with overestimation is that a product ownership team or a product management team knows that their developers are going to overestimate. And so there's already an adversarial system where they know that a certain amount of this is going to happen, so they're inclined to sort of argue back. And over time, if you're consistently overestimating just because you're not sure, the product management team starts to distrust those.
But points aren't time,
estimates.
right? Points are not, you can't tie point to a particular amount of time. right? You can sort of maybe think about that internally, but basically I think about points as a measure of relative complexity. So if I'm looking at something that's a 2, and then we look at another story and it feels more complicated, then maybe it's a 3, and if it feels less complicated, then maybe it's a 1. And so I don't think, I feel like if you start tying points to time, that's not going to give you what you want, because, and I sort of sympathize with the product owners here. They want to be able to put something on a Gantt chart and report to their manager, right? Like, when is this going to be done? But that's just basically impossible in software, and so we should really just give up on that.
But
It's
you
just not
can't,
something
you
we can
can't
do.
know how many of those points you're going to allow into this 2-week sprint unless your team has developed some sort of
You don't need to
sense
know
of
how
we
many,
can
right?
do 50 points in this sprint, right?
So what I get is it's all very subjective, right? It depends. I call it the Myers-Briggs of Agile. It depends on how you feel on that day, right? If you're having a rotten day, you say that it's going to be a 5. It's all a big bag. People has been qualifying estimation as a waste of time, and it is so painful that, like you, they hated that meeting. But in the Agile industry, there are people who are getting very creative. Let's not use fingers or fist of 5 or cards. They go by fruit. Oh, it's a blueberry. It's an apple.
What?
Yes.
Is it what, number
What
of
the-
calories?
Yes.
What, so if it's a watermelon,
Yes. And
is
then,
it worse than if
most-
it's a cantaloupe or a
yes.
mango?
I know, it's crazy. And then people try to be creative, right, to make it lively.
Okay,
Everything's
this
a
one
pumpkin.
is strawberry rhubarb pie.
And then some people use T-shirt sizes. That is one of the more common ones, right? Is it a small, medium, large? And I think that the subject of estimation, I think it needs to be revisited. And I think that even as an Agile coach, estimation to me is just a guess.
Well, and the root of the problem is velocity more than it is estimation, right? We're using velocity as this idea of this is how fast we can go, but that's not actually what it's meant to be, right? It's meant to be like a representation of how much customer-facing value you can deliver in one iteration. And you can average it, right? You can be like, okay, on average, we're getting 12 points done, whatever, per iteration. But that doesn't mean that someone should then use that as a metric, right? This is the problem. And it's that's the problem with putting a number on things. And so maybe this is what they're getting at with the blueberry thing, right? I don't want to put a number on it, but if I put a fruit on it, maybe they'll be less likely to add all the fruits up and try and make me do the same number of fruit next week. Right?
So let's all admit that, yes, there's a lot of conflation of terms and a mismatch. In a sense, I don't think it even matters anymore what Agile was meant to be. What matters is the practice on the ground, and what matters is the practice in the ground for your team. So maybe just throwing away a lot of that borrowed terminology and coming up with, this is what we say works for our team. We're going to come up with different names, call it a blueberry or a pumpkin instead of a number if that really works. But it doesn't really matter that Agile was meant to talk about velocity in these aspirational terms. What matters
I think
is,
Carl just
how's your
gave
team
the
doing?
Agile industry a cardiac arrest.
I said I'm not an Agile person, sorry.
Well, one thing is that I have a favorite saying. And software engineers are smart people. If you start putting numbers, for example, your velocity this week is 20 stories. Next week, we want you to push and go higher, make it 25. Engineers are very smart. If there is a number, if you make it a numbers game, they will game it.
Everything.
So-
I think that's a
into
human
tiny
thing.
little bitty things. That's what they do. I've noticed some of our engineers will just break things into the tiniest, littlest tasks and make each of those like a story point.
Yeah, and also following up your thread on making things as thin slices as possible. There's also a convention that is being practiced. We don't even point stories. Every story is going to be 1 point. Therefore, forcing the product person or the BA or even the engineers to slice stories as thin as 1 point. But what is the complaint here? The complaint is that not every story, every task or every story can be 1 point. So
But
there are a lot
some
of
things
creative
aren't
ways
well
about
enough understood,
estimation.
right? Like the whole idea is that a lot of stuff is not well enough understood when you start on the story to know what those tasks should be. And it's a waste of time to sit in a meeting and try and like enumerate them all, it feels
That's why
like.
someone that I know who is quite respected in the Agile industry is like, no estimation.
So I'll just have to say that this terrifies me, the idea of taking one project and breaking that up into like 40 or 50 stories, because there's an awful lot of meeting overhead involved in every single story. So now you just went from one feature that I have to deal with to now I've got 50 different cards up on the board to manage. That's a lot more work for me, the developer.
What are you talking about? In Agile, we love meetings. Sprint planning, retrospective, backlog grooming, daily stand-ups.
Our sprint planning is now, or our stand-ups, there's a Slack bot now every morning. It's like asking the 3 questions, and I love it. I don't even have to get out of bed to do it.
I saw one team that said that they do their stand-ups in the push-up position. They all get down in push-up position to do their stand-up. That keeps the meeting really damn short.
Yes, and some teams, it's because it's the first thing in the morning, they want to sit down. I said that, no, it's a stand-up. Why can't we sit down? I said that because when you sit down on your fat ass, you tend to talk more. We want this meeting to be legally spaced. Okay, stand up. 3 questions. Yesterday, today, blockers.
So let me just say that I don't blame anyone for like trying to game a system that is obviously corrupt, as most Agile systems are. So I'm not, when I say that this is what it's quote unquote meant to be, I'm not saying that you're doing it wrong, because a lot of us are just sort of trapped in this system, right? Like we're in a large organization, and the organization has decided at some very tall level that like this is what it's going to be. And so I think that like it's worth having a conversation at some point, and this panel is possibly not the right place to do it, about like what do you do if you're in one of these systems and you want to try and improve it, sort of from the leaf nodes up rather than from the top down, right?
Yeah, and where you are accountable for the number of stories that I got a sign that,
I think we're...
Okay. Last question. Last comment, I mean. The thing is that when you are tracked, I do not fault my engineers for being smart to game the system. In fact, I expected them to do. It's only natural, right? It's also your need to make sure that you are at a certain level to the eyes of the management. So I do not fault people or judge. I would think the good word is judge engineers for gaming the system, because it's a system that they put you in. So for code maintainability, I think that we as engineers, or you as engineers, I'm not actually an engineer, I'm a hacker. And then you should say that, well, we'll do it the Kanban way. You want this done at a certain time, what are you willing to give up? And for you as an engineer, code maintainability is not an option.
I would say just never allow anybody on the team, yourself included, to use process as an excuse for cutting those corners. The process is supposed to empower us, and if you've somehow gotten into a place where the process has been abused and we're using the wrong terms and it's not working, and now it's being used as a way as a crutch, throw that process out and start over.
Jina, final comments?
Well, so just going off of the thing you were talking about with the removing items, one thing I've always found very amusing is our product owner will often move things below the line, and then somehow by the end of that meeting, 3 more things move above the line.
Yeah, sneaky.
And it's sneaky, and
Yeah.
I always have to call them out on it.
Yes, call up your product managers. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sarah, final comments?
I already said my final word.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone.